Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about pharaohs or pyramids or ancient treasures. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to become an Egyptian mummy. From the brain-scooping rituals to the beetles that made a home where your intestines used to be, this was no peaceful passage to the afterlife. If you're enjoying our sleepy history journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy community grow across the world. Now close your eyes, lay back, because tonight, you're not just watching history, you're living it. You are dead. That's the good news. The bad news? Your death is only the beginning of your problems. You see, in ancient Egypt, dying doesn't mean rest. It means paperwork, rituals, layers upon layers of linen. It means your soul is now trapped in a bureaucratic, metaphysical waiting room. A place filled with spells, scarabs, judgment scales, and the constant looming threat of being eaten by a hybrid crocodile-hippopotamus-lion monster. Welcome to the afterlife. But before you can navigate any of that, your body needs to be prepped. Not gently, mind you, but in a way that involves hooks, salt, fire, and linen strips, tight enough to cause post-mortem claustrophobia. You're about to become a mummy. Not the Hollywood horror kind. The historically accurate, deeply uncomfortable, chemically marinated kind. First, you'll be carted off to the Yibu, the place of purification. Sounds relaxing, doesn't it? Like a spa. It is not a spa. It's a hut on the edge of town near the river, filled with men holding bronze tools and looking far too enthusiastic for people whose job is to scoop out human bits. The process begins with a wash. Your body is rinsed in water from the Nile, not for cleanliness, but because sacred geography is everything. Then comes the smell, a strange combination of river mud, incense, and lingering death. It's as if someone burned cinnamon near a fish market and called it holy. Now let's talk about your brain. You probably liked your brain, had memories, thoughts, secrets, all gone now. A hooked instrument is inserted through your nostril and, with the grace of a blindfolded toddler at a sandcastle contest, they scramble your brain like an omelette and drain it out your nose. Why? Because Egyptians thought the brain was useless mush. The heart, they believed, was the seat of intelligence and emotion, which is why your heart will be carefully preserved, unless your embalmers accidentally throw it out with your stomach. That happened more than once. Oops. Next, they open your torso with a sharp ceremonial blade. Not casually, this part is important. There are strict rituals to follow. The cut is made on the left side of the abdomen, and then your organs are removed and individually pickled. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver each get their own fancy little jar. The jars are guarded by the 4 sons of Horus, who, depending on your beliefs, are either divine protectors or just animal-headed hall monitors for your guts. Your kidneys? Eh? Sometimes they made the cut, sometimes not. The bladder and spleen, straight to the discard pile. And your lungs, despite being the size of papyrus scrolls, often ended up looking like sad meat balloons. Now for the real spa treatment. Natron. A naturally occurring salt mixture with the absorbency of 1,000 paper towels and the scent of ancient foot powder. You're completely packed and covered in this gritty white miracle mineral, then left to sit for 40 days, alone, in a pit, in the desert, slowly becoming what can best be described as a human raisin in a salt dungeon. Your skin begins to shrink, your cheeks collapse, your belly deflates like an old wineskin. But hey, you're staying fresh for the afterlife. That's the point. Rot is failure. Wrinkles are holy. Moisture is the enemy. If you still look vaguely juicy after a week, your embalmers will panic and apply more natron with the urgency of someone fixing a leaky roof during monsoon season. After the 40 days, you're removed from the natron and inspected like a prized ham. If you pass, the body gets stuffed with linen, sawdust, resin-soaked reeds, and in wealthier cases little packets of herbs and perfumes. This isn't about comfort, it's about shape. You must look plump but not too plump. You must look peaceful but not alive. You must smell divine but never of human flesh. In other words, you're being taxidermied for spiritual bureaucracy. Then begins the wrapping. Layer after layer of linen is wound around you with the care of someone gift wrapping a screaming porcupine. The fingers get wrapped, the toes get wrapped. Sometimes each individual digit is wrapped separately. You're slowly losing all human form, becoming a cocoon of cloth, soaked in tree resin so flammable you're basically kindling by the end. The resin smells of pine and sandalwood. For a moment it's almost lovely, until it hardens. Then it's more like being entombed in a scented shellac. Amulets are inserted between layers, not randomly either. Each one serves a purpose. Scarabs for rebirth, ankhs for life, eyes of Horus for protection. The embalmers chant as they go, reciting spells from the Book of the Dead. A collection of over 190 spells designed to help your soul navigate the afterlife, including such crucial lines as spell for not dying a second time, and spell for not having to eat feces in the underworld. Yes, that was apparently a real concern. Once fully wrapped, your mouth is opened with a ceremonial tool. This is the opening of the mouth ritual. No, not to scream, but to let your soul eat and speak again in the afterlife. The tool used looks like a fish spine crossed with a tuning fork. It's touched to your lips, your eyes, your ears. Symbolically, you're being rebooted, like ancient spiritual tech support. You're then placed in a coffin, or several coffins nested like Russian dolls. The rich got multiple sarcophagi. The poor got reed mats or repurposed furniture. Some were even buried in communal pits, where your beautifully wrapped body would rub shoulders with someone else's uncle, who couldn't afford the deluxe package. The walls of the tomb might be painted with spells and offerings, or just graffiti from bored workers complaining about lunch. And then you wait for eternity. Not a metaphorical eternity, a literal sand-blown, crypt-sealed eternity, waiting for your soul to journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, where your heart will be weighed against a feather. If your heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin, guilt, or just a particularly hearty lunch, you will be devoured by Amit, the crocodile lion hippo demon. If your heart passes, you get to join the field of reeds, an eternal paradise that looks suspiciously like an ancient barley farm. But here's the kicker. Your eternal fate is deeply tied to how intact your body remains. That's right. Tomb robbers aren't just stealing gold, they're stealing your afterlife. If someone swipes your amulets, breaks your nose, or accidentally sets you on fire with a torch, you might not just be cursed, you might be erased. Spiritually inconvenienced, soulfully evicted. So you lie there, wrapped, embalmed, entombed, hoping your legacy isn't looted, hoping your spells hold up, hoping no one invents archaeology, and as sand drifts over your tomb and centuries pass above, your shriveled toes clutch your secrets. Your hollow chest echoes with lost breath. Your jaw, permanently open, still remembers the ritual words. You're no longer just a person. You're preservation, your memory, your mystery. You're a mummy, and your journey has only just begun. You may think that once you're wrapped in linen, painted with spells, and locked in a stone box under 30 feet of sand and ceremonial bricks, your job is done. You can finally rest in peace, right? Unfortunately, ancient Egyptian peace came with a thick asterisk and a footnote in the Book of the Dead labelled "Conditions Apply." Because for your afterlife to actually happen, your body needed to remain intact. That's not easy in a land where grave robbing was basically a full-time profession. Tomb rats considered mummies a delicacy, and future Europeans with pickaxes would one day come snooping for souvenirs, while wearing inappropriate pith helmets. To start, your tomb is supposed to be sealed tight with curses, guardian statues, and architectural tricks meant to confuse any would-be looter. Hidden doors, fake burial chambers, sloped tunnels that lead to nowhere, and walls painted with scary images of demon baboons flinging cosmic knives. These weren't just decorative choices, they were defensive systems. Ancient Egyptians treated the protection of your corpse with the same seriousness that modern banks apply to vault security. Except instead of lasers and motion sensors, you had limestone plugs and supernatural threats involving soul-devouring snakes. The irony, of course, is that the richer you were, the more loot you had to steal. Pharaohs went all out. Solid gold masks, jewel-encrusted finger sheaths, miniature boats for ghostly travel, canopic jars shaped like animal-headed gods, and entire storerooms of honey, beer, and bread so crusty it could be used as a weapon. And what did all that lavish preparation do? It advertised to every hungry worker, disgruntled embalmer, or morally flexible nephew that your tomb was a buffet of opportunity. Some thieves even had the audacity to mummify themselves after stealing from other tombs, believing that the gods would overlook their crimes if they showed up shrink-wrapped in piety. The state tried to stop it. Tomb raiding was a capital offence. Thieves were hunted down, interrogated, and often executed in delightfully ironic ways, such as being impaled next to the very tombs they looted. Court records from the 20th dynasty even include full confession transcripts, where suspects admitted to melting gold off sarcophagi and stuffing their tunics with perfume-soaked linen. They often named names too, proving that betrayal was a team sport in the Valley of the Kings. But not every threat was a man with a chisel. Nature had its own way of desecrating you. Rats. Yes, rats. Tomb rats were no myth. Drawn by the smell of dried meat and ancient spices, they'd find their way through cracks in the rock and gnaw through linen like it was a starter course. More than one royal foot was found partially chewed, with tiny rodent teeth marks preserving a story no hieroglyph ever dared to record. In response, embalmers sometimes filled bodies with sawdust soaked in bitumen, a sticky substance so foul it could deter most pests. But even that didn't always work. If a tomb was built poorly or collapsed slightly, moisture would creep in, mould would bloom, linen would rot, and your eternal body, carefully wrapped and protected for judgment, would begin to look like a forgotten roast left in the rain. Then there were the early tourists. Long before modern Egyptology became a scholarly field, curious conquerors and wealthy collectors treated mummies like collectible novelties. By the Greco-Roman period, mummies were being shipped abroad, not for science, for entertainment. Some were burned as fuel, others were ground into powder and sold as medicine. That's right. In Europe, powdered mummy, known as mumia, was believed to cure everything from headaches to epilepsy. It was expensive, bitter, and extremely unethical. But that never stopped a Renaissance nobleman from sprinkling a little ancient Egyptian foot dust into his wine just to feel immortal. Even in Egypt, the idea of mummies as resources didn't end with religious reverence. During the 19th century, local tomb raiders would sell mummified animals by the sack. Entire warehouses were filled with cat mummies. People thought they were sacred votive offerings. Many were. Others were just rolled up scraps of cloth with a chicken bone inside sold to unsuspecting archaeologists, desperate for a genuine artifact. Scams are eternal. But let's say for argument's sake that your tomb remains sealed, your body intact, no thieves, no rats, no enthusiastic European doctors looking for ancient nasal bone powder. Congratulations, you've made it past the earthly threats. Now comes the metaphysical nonsense. The Egyptians believed that your soul was composed of multiple parts. The ka, your life force. The ba, your personality. The ak, your ghostly immortal essence. All of them needed to reunite with your body at night so you could eat, speak, and generally not dissolve into oblivion. But if your face was damaged or unrecognizable, your bae might fly right past your tomb, thinking you were someone else. To solve this, your coffin was decorated with paintings of your face. Not an idealized version either, often a literal portrait. It was like ID for the afterlife. If your ghost showed up and couldn't match the face on the box, you risked spiritual identity theft. No refunds, no appeals. To keep your spiritual parts in sync, tombs were also stocked with ushabtis, tiny figurines meant to work in your place during afterlife labour. Because apparently eternity was full of chores, farming, cooking, building. The gods had no problem making you immortal, then sending you directly into divine unpaid labour. So you packed servants, dozens, sometimes hundreds, little clay or wooden dolls carved with spells that said, "Here, let this guy hoe the fields instead of me." Egyptian unionization at its finest. Still, some people wanted more than dolls and portraits. Some wanted eternal fame. They inscribed every inch of their tombs with hieroglyphs detailing their lives, their titles, their virtues, and their hopes for divine acceptance. They paid scribes to write flattering accounts. They carved boasts into limestone. They bribed priests to recite their names in rituals long after the family line had forgotten them. Because to the ancient Egyptian, to be forgotten was to die a second time. Memory was immortality. A prayer said in your name by a stranger 2,000 years later was just as important as a golden scarab in your ribcage. Which brings us to the final irony. The very thing you feared most, exposure, looting, decay, might be the only reason your name still survives. The tombs that were found, the bodies that were unwrapped, the coffins that were cracked open and studied by flashlight and trowel, they are the ones still whispered about. Not by priests, but by school children. Not in temples, but in museums. You're famous because your secrets were stolen. Because someone somewhere couldn't help but lift the lid and see what was inside. Because the human urge to poke the sacred is stronger than any curse. And now here you are, wrapped in linen, encased in glass under museum lighting, with tourists snapping photos beside a display case. Your amulets have been catalogued, your organs stored in climate-controlled drawers, your identity labelled with a placard based on educated guesses. You survived the rats, the robbers, the Renaissance physicians, and the ravages of time. But you couldn't escape curiosity. You are a mummy, and you are more alive than ever. Your afterlife continues in the strangest way possible, through strangers staring at you while eating vending machine granola bars. But eternity is not over yet. There are still more secrets hidden in your wrappings, more rituals sealed in stone, more oddities embalmed in the folds of sacred linen. And beneath the dust and the resin, something ancient still stirs. Your journey is only just beginning. Your body is preserved, mostly. Your tomb is sealed, probably. Your afterlife is in motion, though not exactly with the grace of a celestial chariot. But amid all the linen and resin, the sacred spells and the soul fragment logistics, one detail is impossible to ignore. You smell awful, or at least you should, because despite all the ceremony and prayers, you are by every metric a very old and very dead person in a very warm climate. But somehow, ancient Egyptians found a way to make the scent of slow decomposition socially acceptable. The result was a strange olfactory symphony, a mix of sacred pine, fermented spices, smoke-stung myrrh, dusty linen, and underneath it all the ghost of meat. Not fresh meat, not even old meat. Meat that had once been human ambition, now sealed in a sarcophagus and slowly marinating in a tomb filled with aromatic distractions. Let's start with the ingredients. Natron, the salty drying agent packed inside and around your body, was key. It absorbed every drop of moisture it could find, including the natural juices of your organs, skin, and any unfortunate insects that wandered too close. But natron came with its own scent. It was earthy, mineral-heavy, and faintly metallic, like wet sand left too long in the sun. Not offensive, but not delightful either, more like a warning. Then came the oils. The embalmers applied thick layers of palm oil and cedar oil, often infused with herbs like coriander, cassia, or cinnamon. The purpose was twofold. First, to anoint and sanctify your skin. Second, to smother the smell of rot like an ancient air freshener with divine approval. You became less of a corpse and more of a walking spice rack, minus the walking. Tree resins played a major role. Frankincense and myrrh were burned during the rituals and painted directly onto your skin during embalming. Myrrh, in particular, had antiseptic qualities. It fought bacteria, soothed wounds, and in high doses made you smell like the inside of a sacred incense burner. Of course, that only helped so much. Resin could mask decay, but not erase it. Your embalmers knew this, which is why they took an extra step. They boiled certain resins into a pitch-black goo known as bitumen. Bitumen was not gentle. It was thick, sticky, and had the consistency of roofing tar left in the sun. It clung to your linen wrappings like syrup on dry toast. Once applied, it hardened into a crust that sealed in everything, including the smell. You became an aromatic statue. Ancient visitors to tombs sometimes describe the scent as overwhelming. Not necessarily bad, but unforgettable. Like being punched in the face by a priest carrying a pot of incense and a bag of licorice root. Embalmers did not always agree on what worked best. Some preferred using more cedar oil, believing it penetrated deeper into the flesh and left a more pleasant smell. Others swore by a formula involving juniper berries, beeswax and desert herbs. The result was that no two mummies smelled exactly the same. If your neighbour in the tomb had more money, they might smell faintly of lavender and acacia wood. You, on the other hand, might give off the aroma of old onions and singed pine. This olfactory improvisation extended to the burial goods as well. Your tomb would be filled with scented items meant to assist in your spiritual journey. Jars of unguents, cones of perfumed wax, sacks of incense. Some of these were intended for ritual use, others were simply to make your eternal lodging more tolerable. After all, you were expected to host your soul, your car, your bar, and the occasional visiting spirit. The last thing anyone wanted was for the divine banquet to smell like failure. Of course, the smell was not just for the gods, it was also a message to the living. A properly embalmed body gave off a certain scent that indicated wealth, status, and spiritual purity. Smell was power. If you walked past a tomb and caught the fragrance of burning kaifi, a luxurious blend of 20 ingredients including wine, honey, and galbanum, you knew someone important was rotting politely nearby. Ironically, while your embalmers worked to preserve your scent, they were often overwhelmed by it. Working with decaying flesh in the Egyptian heat was not glamorous. Historical records mention that embalmers would burn incense constantly, not just for spiritual reasons, but to keep from passing out. Some wore protective coverings soaked in aromatic oil. Others simply developed a tolerance that could only be described as spiritually gifted or medically concerning. And then there were the visitors. Tombs were not always sealed forever. In many cases, family members returned regularly to perform rituals. They brought food offerings, burned incense, recited spells, and made sure your spiritual hygiene was in order. If they walked in and found your tomb smelling wrong, it was considered a bad omen. The scent of your body was supposed to be a signal that your soul was still present, still at peace, still intact. But sometimes things went wrong. If moisture had crept into the tomb, if a jar of oil had burst, if rats had burrowed into your chest cavity and left behind their own aromatic signature. These disruptions were serious. A foul-smelling tomb could cause panic. priests might be summoned, new spells would be chanted, additional layers of resin would be applied. In extreme cases, your remains might be rewrapped, repainted, or moved entirely. Because nothing said divine instability quite like a mummy that reeked of failure. Yet for all the concern about smell, the ancient Egyptians saw it as part of a larger truth. Scents were not just physical, they were spiritual. The right aroma could guide a soul, the wrong one could mislead it. Frankincense was associated with the gods, myrrh with sacred transitions, cedar with preservation. If your tomb smelled like a sacred grove, you were doing something right. If it smelled like a damp pantry, you were in serious afterlife trouble. This belief extended into the texts themselves. The Book of the Dead includes spells that describe the air of the afterlife as filled with perfume. Paradise was not just visually beautiful, it was fragrant. To live forever was to breathe in fields of Kai-Fi, to be anointed in lotus oil, to walk through halls of cedar smoke and honey-scented wind. In this cosmology, scent was more than comfort. It was identity. It was memory. It was divine proof that you had been seen, embalmed, and remembered. And so you lie there, sealed in your tomb, surrounded by layers of linen soaked in oils that once cost more than livestock. The air is thick with the echoes of sacred resin. The dust clings to everything. The perfume has faded with time, but somewhere, deep in the folds of cloth, a trace remains. A whisper of what you were meant to be. A reminder that even in death, presentation mattered. You do not rot. You ferment gently. You do not reek. You radiate preparation. And in the stillness of eternity, you smell like someone who took their afterlife very seriously. The question now is whether that scent will last long enough for your soul to find you again. Because the next time a tomb door creaks open, it may not be a priest. It may not be a family member with incense and prayers. It may be a stranger with gloves and a flashlight, ready to catalogue your scent in a museum database. And when that moment comes, your aroma will speak louder than any spell. You're a mummy, and your fragrance is your legacy. You are sealed in darkness. The last hints of resin and incense still cling to the air like a perfume that refuses to give up. Your linen-wrapped limbs are stiff, your jaw is forever agape, and your ears are filled with dust. But this is not a void. This is a residence, an eternal address, a tomb that was designed, decorated and furnished for the sole purpose of hosting your shriveled corpse and whatever spiritual traffic might pass through. And while you may not be moving anymore, your surroundings were built to make it feel like you never really stopped living. Ancient Egyptian tombs were not dreary, they were fully immersive autobiographies. Your tomb told a story, not the story of your death, but the story you wanted told after it. Carved into walls were scenes of your triumphs, your professions, your family, your offerings to gods, and your occasional fantasy about fishing successfully forever. These images were not symbolic, they were functional. A depiction of you holding a loaf of bread was not art, it was insurance. It meant you would receive bread in the afterlife. The more detailed the image, the better the delivery. Some tombs showed full bakeries in operation, complete with workers, ovens and storage jars. You were not just being buried, you were commissioning a supernatural catering service. The walls were not the only thing doing heavy spiritual lifting. Your tomb was arranged like a house, a good one, not a cramped little cubbyhole. The wealthy elite had multiple rooms, storage spaces and false doors. These false doors were not accidents, they were metaphysical portals. Your soul was expected to pass through them, back and forth, during ritual offerings. Priests would come to the tomb, chant spells and place food and drink before these false doors. If the ceremony went well, your car would absorb the essence of the offerings. If not, you might spend the night with spiritual indigestion. Furniture was common. Beds, chairs, stools and tables were all brought in. Not because you would use them physically, but because the gods would notice their absence. Tombs without furniture implied negligence. Worse, poverty. And no one wanted the gods thinking they'd been buried on a budget. Even pharaohs who had never touched their own sandals made sure to include multiple pairs in their tombs, just in case eternity required footwear rotation. Some tombs went further. Miniature models were included to represent everyday life. Boats, granaries, breweries, slaughterhouses, all rendered in careful detail with little wooden figures mid-action. These were not toys. These were metaphysical blueprints. The ancient Egyptians believed that these models would become real in the afterlife. If you packed a model brewery, you would have beer. If you included a tiny bakery, you got bread. If you were clever enough to include a model servant feeding a model goose, congratulations, your afterlife had roast poultry and table service. But the practicality of these models raises some awkward questions. What if the model goose got loose in the afterlife kitchen? What if your model boat capsized in the eternal Nile? What if your tiny brewer decided he was spiritually done with being underpaid? The texts do not say. But considering how many spells are dedicated to calming servants and appeasing gods, it is safe to assume the Egyptians planned for spiritual HR issues. Your tomb also came with a climate. Unfortunately, it was not ideal. While the outer desert was dry enough to preserve your remains, the interior of tombs could be tricky. If sealed too tightly, gases from decaying organic matter might build up and cause explosions, not metaphorical ones. Literal mummy bloating followed by a linen rupture. Embalmers tried to avoid this by puncturing the abdomen and packing it with sawdust and resin, but tomb climate was unpredictable. Some tombs became slightly damp due to condensation, which encouraged mold growth. Others were invaded by beetles, ants, or even snakes. It was not unheard of for priests entering a tomb to find nests of animals living among the dead. Which begs the question, in a metaphysical real estate sense, who pays rent when the tenant is both spiritually present and physically unresponsive? One of the most striking features of a tomb was its alignment. Many tombs were carefully oriented towards specific stars, particularly Sirius and the constellation Orion. These stars were associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife. When Sirius rose in the sky, it marked the beginning of the Nile flood, and therefore renewal and rebirth. Your tomb was not just pointed toward the heavens out of tradition. It was aimed like a celestial antenna. You were expected to catch the signal, download the divine updates, and continue ascending. Failing to align your tomb properly was like dying with a broken compass. Eternity is long. You did not want to spend it lost in spiritual traffic. Despite all this planning, tombs were still subject to change. Earthquakes, tomb robbers, shifting sands, and budget cuts could all impact your eternal floor plan. Some tombs were started early in life but never finished. Others were repurposed from previous owners, with the original names scratched out and new ones carved in. The gods were apparently understanding about this. As long as the rituals were observed and the offerings made, the branding could be flexible. And let us not forget the sarcophagus. This was not just a box. It was your throne, often made of stone or gilded wood, decorated with protective texts, and shaped to resemble your idealized self. It was both armor and advertisement. The richer you were, the more nested coffins you had. Pharaohs sometimes had 4 or 5, each one more elaborate than the last, like a cosmic matryoshka doll of eternal overachievement. These layers were not redundant. Each served as an additional spiritual buffer, one to hold the body, one to hold the spells, one to confuse intruders, one to impress the gods, and one just in case the others failed. Inside the tomb, everything had a purpose. The placement of items, the colour of paint, the angle of inscriptions. Red ochre was used for protective spells, blue symbolised the heavens, yellow for the flesh of gods. Every detail was part of a cosmic language, readable only by those trained in the sacred arts, which meant that if your tomb was decorated by an amateur or someone on a tight schedule, your entire afterlife might depend on a hieroglyph misspelling that turned eternal joy into eternal soup. Despite the seriousness of tomb architecture, it was also a place of experimentation. Some tombs included elaborate mazes meant to trap spirits or robbers. Others had secret compartments hidden behind false panels. There are even examples of tomb graffiti, notes left by workers complaining about supervisors or marking lunch breaks with drawings of cats. The afterlife, it seems, had its own sense of workplace culture, and here you remain, resting in a space carefully curated to present your soul as worthy, wealthy, and well-prepared. You're surrounded by objects you cannot use, furniture you cannot sit on, and meals you cannot eat, unless your soul returns precisely at the right moment. Your spiritual real estate is sacred but vulnerable. Time wears down walls, earth shifts, paint fades, languages are lost, and yet your tomb tells its story anyway. To those who find it centuries later, it will appear mysterious. A cryptic chamber filled with symbols, statues, and half-decayed bundles of linen. But to you, it was once your home, your sanctuary, your personal insurance policy against cosmic erasure. As a mummy, your house is full of guests you did not invite. They come with torches and notebooks. They take measurements, whisper theories, and make documentaries about your furniture. They label you with numbers and store your offerings in boxes, but your walls still whisper. Your models still stand. Your false door is still there, waiting. Because eternity may not be what you imagined. The tomb is still. Your soul is not. You're no longer just a wrapped body sealed in darkness. You're also something else now, something lighter. The bar, your spirit, flutters loose like a bird with your face. It hovers above your tomb, waits for the rituals to be done, then begins its journey into the great and terrible bureaucracy of the afterlife. This is where the gods come in, dozens of them, all with titles, responsibilities, overlapping jurisdictions, and in many cases very confusing animal parts. Welcome to the most crowded spiritual department in history. The Egyptian afterlife was not run by a single god with a flowing beard and a clipboard. It was more like an ancient divine parliament. Every god had a job, a jurisdiction, and sometimes a weird fashion choice. Some gods helped you, others judged you. A few might accidentally turn you into a frog if you failed to bow correctly. The key was to know who you were dealing with, what they controlled, and how likely they were to throw you into a crocodile pit for poor paperwork. At the centre of it all was Osiris, dead god of the dead. He ruled the underworld from a golden throne while wrapped in linen and painted green, because apparently once you're murdered, dismembered, resurrected, and placed in charge of eternal judgment, colour coordination becomes symbolic. Green represented rebirth. It also made him look slightly mouldy, which was fitting for a deity whose iconography involved sitting perfectly still in a tomb while other gods did all the talking. Before you reached Osiris, however, you had to pass a series of metaphysical checkpoints. One of the most important was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. He was the first to greet you at the gates. Tall, black, sleek, and calm, Anubis was the one who had overseen your mummification. He knew what you looked like inside and out. He had guided your body through purification, watched over your organs, and supervised your wrapping. Now he would guide your soul through judgment. Think of him as both your undertaker and your spiritual defense attorney. Anubis brought you to the Hall of Maat. This was the great chamber of truth, balance, and cosmic ethics. Here you would undergo the weighing of the heart, one of the most important events in your undead calendar. On one side of the scale went your heart, preserved and rehydrated by the priests. On the other side, a feather. Not just any feather, the feather of Mayat, goddess of truth, justice, and universal order. If your heart was heavier than the feather, you failed. If it balanced or weighed less, you passed. This ritual was not symbolic. It was believed to be absolutely literal. Your heart had recorded every lie, betrayal, stolen loaf of bread, and gossip session about temple priests. If it carried too much spiritual weight, you would be fed to Amit, a chimeric monster with the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo. She did not negotiate. She did not offer second chances. She waited beneath the scales and chewed on eternally unworthy hearts with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been very bored for a very long time. If you passed the test, the gods began to take notice. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, stood beside the scale with a writing palette. He recorded the results like a cosmic accountant, making sure no one fudged the numbers. Thoth was respected and feared. He invented writing. He controlled time. He also had the neck of a bird, which made head tilts especially dramatic. Standing nearby was Mat herself. Often depicted wearing a single ostrich feather on her head, she embodied cosmic order. Without her, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, and the gods would fall into chaos. Her presence in the judgment hall ensured fairness, which was ironic considering that many Egyptians included cheat sheets in their tombs. The Book of the Dead contained entire chapters of suggested things to say during your judgment. You were literally buried with a spiritual script. If honesty failed, recitation might save you. Once judged, you moved forward. Or at least your act did, the aspect of your soul that had become luminous and divine. This part of you was now free to enter the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. It looked suspiciously like regular Egypt, but without taxes or heat stroke. Lush fields, endless crops, gentle breezes, and eternal peace. You could farm all day and not get tired. You could eat without getting full. You could sit by the Nile forever, listening to the wind and watching sacred birds do sacred bird things. But even paradise was not free of divine supervision. God still wandered these fields. Some watched over the gates, others performed rituals. A few just existed as reminders that spiritual retirement came with occasional performance reviews. One gate might be guarded by a cobra with 7 heads, another by a god with a beetle for a face and a tendency to speak only in riddles. Navigation required charm, memory, and a strong stomach. Not all gods you encountered were friendly. Set, the god of chaos and desert, still lurked in the background. He was the one who had killed Osiris in myth, scattering his body across Egypt. While Set was sometimes revered for his strength and protective nature, he also symbolized disorder. If your soul wandered too far into his domain, you might end up lost in a storm of confusion, spiritually windburned and full of metaphysical regret. Then there was Ra, the sun god, creator, fireball in the sky. He travelled through the underworld each night in a solar bark, a divine boat that carried him through darkness and death so that he could rise again each morning. Some texts describe your soul joining his crew. You might spend eternity rowing a celestial ship through rivers of stars, fighting off giant serpents like Apophis, who tried to eat the sun with every setting. It was an honour. It was also mandatory overtime. And let us not forget Bastet, cat goddess of home, fertility, and protection. While often seen as gentle, she had a wrathful side. Her twin nature meant you could be blessed with comfort or cursed with claws. If you had treated cats poorly in life, you might find her judgment swift and silent. The Egyptians loved their cats. They mummified them. They deified them. They hired temple staff specifically to care for them. Your feline karma mattered. There were over 2,000 gods in the Egyptian pantheon, some well known, others obscure. Tefnut, goddess of moisture, Khonsu, god of the moon, Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. Each played a role in the vast spiritual network. Many had temples, some had festivals. A few were represented in tomb paintings, offering blessings or warnings. You were expected to know their names, their preferences, and their symbols. Because in the afterlife, misidentifying a god could result in anything from embarrassment to obliteration. This spiritual hierarchy reflected the Egyptian worldview. Life was order. Death was continuation. The gods maintained balance, and you were part of that machinery. Not a cog, but a participant. Your soul had responsibilities, rituals, appointments, and the occasional conversation with a crocodile monster. Yet despite the complexity, the system had clarity. You knew what was expected. Live a just life. Honour the gods. Pay your priests. Get embalmed properly. Include your heart. Pack your Book of the Dead. Make regular offerings. And above all, never forget to call Ra by all his names when the sun disappeared, because he might take it personally. And so your soul travels, through chambers and halls, past falcon-headed judges and baboon scribes, through portals guarded by snakes and statues with eyes that blink. You speak the words, you pass the tests, you find your place. Because you're no longer just a mummy. You're a petitioner, a traveller, a hopeful participant in an afterlife with more bureaucracy than an empire, and more animal heads than a petting zoo. And your journey is far from over. Because now comes the part nobody ever wants to talk about. The cost, the price tag, the surprisingly complicated bill for your sacred transformation into a dried and decorated husk of former humanity. Dying in ancient Egypt was not just a spiritual ordeal. It was a full-blown business transaction, and you were the product. Embalming was not cheap. Dignity was itemized, and immortality had a sliding fee scale. First came the consultation. This was not unlike modern funerals, except instead of sitting across from someone in a necktie holding a clipboard, your family stood before a priest holding a bronze hook and a price list that might as well have been written on papyrus soaked in tears. The embalming priest acted as a kind of spiritual contractor. He would explain the options. Do you want your brain removed? Standard. How about individual finger wrapping? That costs extra. Would you like the deluxe amulet set? Do you need protective resin layers, or are you planning on winging it through the duat? There were typically 3 official packages. Herodotus, the Greek historian with a flair for uncomfortable details, described them with shocking clarity. The highest tier involved full organ removal, a natron bath, high-quality linen, rare oils, expensive resins, and gilded features. This was the luxury suite. Pharaoh-level pampering. You were guaranteed to arrive in the afterlife looking like a sacred fruit roll-up, wrapped in gold foil and divine approval. The middle tier was for the ambitious middle class. Some shortcuts were taken. Fewer resins, thinner linens, organ jars might be symbolic rather than functional. Instead of removing the stomach, embalmers might simply inject cedar oil into the cavity and let it dissolve everything from the inside out. It worked, mostly. The smell could be aggressive, but the results were passable, especially if viewed from a respectful distance. The lowest tier was where things got interesting. If you could not afford a full embalming, your options became creative. Some embalmers skipped internal procedures entirely and simply dried the body with natron, covered it with bitumen and wrapped it quickly. Others packed the torso with sawdust and cloth, then sealed it shut like a spiritual piñata. In some cases, facial features were painted directly onto linen since reconstructing them with resin was more expensive. If a family was truly desperate, they might bury you without any embalming at all and just hope no one noticed. But mummification was not just about technique, it was about performance. Rituals had to be done, spells recited, priests paid. Every gesture had a cost, every oil had a supplier. Embalming required a team. There were cutters, stuffers, washers, oilers, wrappers, and scribes. Some embalmers were artisans. Others were basically mortuary freelancers who knew how to turn a body into something that smelled less like failure and more like expensive incense. They charged accordingly. And then there was the location. The Valley of the Kings was prime real estate, but only for royalty. Nobles could build tombs nearby, but even those came at a cost. The further from the sacred necropolis, the cheaper the land. Some were buried in tombs hacked into cliffs or old quarries. Others were placed in reused tombs, where previous tenants were quietly relocated to make room. Recycling was not just practical, it was economical. As long as the body was wrapped and the door sealed, few asked questions. This economy extended to the tomb contents. Amulets, statues, scrolls, and canopic jars were expensive. Not everyone could afford real lapis lazuli or gold, so artisans produced fakes. Glazed faience amulets that mimicked turquoise, painted wood instead of ivory. Sometimes the contents of jars were not even the organs they claimed to protect. Archaeologists have found canopic jars filled with rags, sand, and in one case, what appeared to be a pig's liver wearing a spell written for human lungs. The priests, of course, were always compensated. They maintained your spiritual schedule, offering days, feast days, recitation anniversaries. Wealthy families paid for a priest to recite your name annually to keep your soul active in the afterlife. This was known as the cult of the dead. Think of it as a subscription service. If payment stopped, so did the prayers. And without those prayers, your memory faded, and your spiritual stability wobbled like a badly balanced scale. To pay for all of this, families sometimes sold land, livestock, or heirlooms. Funerary expenses were among the largest financial burdens a household could face. Some even took loans from temple estates. The temples, being essentially divine banks, were happy to offer spiritual credit in exchange for earthly property. These arrangements were binding. Fail to repay, and your descendants might lose everything except your sarcophagus, which by then was probably filled with IOUs and dried onions. For the truly poor, community burial grounds existed. These were less ornate, more practical. Bodies were wrapped in simple linen, placed in shallow pits, and covered in stone or mud bricks. There was no room for amulets or spells, no priests reciting your name. You were buried with the hope that the gods would notice you anyway, that your soul would slip past the bureaucracy like a clever servant sneaking out the back gate. Some families tried to cheat the system. They bribed embalmers for extra amulets. They reused old scrolls. They forged tomb inscriptions. One common trick was to carve someone else's name into a damaged sarcophagus, hoping the gods would not mind. Another was to bury multiple bodies in one tomb, each with their own spells but a shared address. Spiritual roommates, eternity on a budget. Despite all this, the economy of death was not just transactional, it was aspirational. People saved for decades to afford a proper burial. They made deals with artisans, joined burial societies, and attended funerary rehearsals. Yes, those existed. Some communities practiced funerals ahead of time to ensure the real one would go smoothly. It was theatre, economics, and theology rolled into one solemn production. And you, the future mummy, were both the star and the bill. Even in death, class mattered. A rich mummy might lie in gilded silence surrounded by offerings and carved prayers. A poor mummy might be tucked into a reused niche with no name and only a vague sense of orientation. Yet both were headed to the same afterlife. Same gates, same gods, same crocodile monster with a feather-based personality test. And here you are, still wrapped, still waiting. Your tomb a reflection of every financial decision made before your final breath. Your linen speaks of status, your resin of economy, your amulets of ambition, and your afterlife, that endless spiritual frontier, is shaped by receipts etched in stone and prayers paid for in livestock and barley. Because even in eternity, someone had to foot the bill, and you, the mummy, were both the investment and the outcome. But as your soul drifts somewhere between eternal fields of reeds and a tomb that smells like sacred onions and pine tar, it starts to notice something unusual. You're not alone. There are others nearby. Some have feathers, others have paws, a few have wings, tails, or rows of tiny sacred teeth. Because in ancient Egypt, people were not the only ones who got mummified. Animals did too, thousands of them, sometimes millions, and some of them got better treatment than you. At first, the presence of a few sacred animals might seem reasonable. After all, ancient Egyptians worshipped gods who looked like animals. They had deities with falcon heads, jackal snouts, crocodile jaws, and lion paws. The logic followed that real animals must also have divine qualities, but what started as symbolic reverence quickly snowballed into a full-blown spiritual pet industry. Entire species were recruited into religious service, embalmed, wrapped, and entombed with the kind of care usually reserved for pharaohs or high priests. You were told the afterlife would be full of challenges. You were not told it would include a long line of cats ahead of you at the gates. Cats, of course, were the undisputed celebrities. Associated with the goddess Bastet, they were seen as protectors, companions, and divine incarnations. Killing a cat, even by accident, was punishable by death. People shaved their eyebrows in mourning when one died, and yes, they were mummified in staggering numbers. Wealthy families sometimes had their favourite house cats embalmed and entombed beside them, complete with miniature sarcophagi, amulets, and painted wrappings. These feline burials were not just sentimental, they were strategic. A sacred cat in the afterlife might act as a guardian, a spiritual companion, or at the very least a reminder that someone was watching your offerings and judging your posture. But cats were only the beginning. Hawks and falcons were mummified in honour of Horus, the sky god. Ibises were preserved for Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. Bulls were venerated as living representations of gods like Apis and Ptah. Crocodiles were embalmed for Sobek, the river deity with a taste for raw meat and divine intimidation. Even scarab beetles, those tiny armoured dung-rolling champions of the desert, were preserved and wrapped in linen with microscopic precision. Imagine spending your whole life preparing for eternity, only to discover you were buried next to a beetle with better resin quality and more ceremonial chanting. The scale of animal mummification was staggering. Archaeologists have uncovered entire necropolises dedicated solely to animals. In one site near Saqqara, over 4 million mummified ibises were discovered, stacked like divine paperwork in shelves and vaults. Catacombs were filled with rows upon rows of feline coffins. Some were painted, others were gilded. A few had inscriptions praising their loyalty, wisdom, or apparent talent for protecting grain. No one ever wrote that much about you. You were lucky to get your name spelled correctly. Temples sponsored animal cults. Priests maintained flocks of sacred geese, herds of ceremonial bulls, and colonies of cats with better healthcare than most farmers. These animals were raised specifically for mummification, a kind of divine livestock industry, where the product was not food, but spiritual credibility. Offerings of animal mummies were seen as prayers made physical. People would purchase a mummified animal, offer it at a temple, and hope the gods noticed. It was like sending a gift basket to the afterlife. You just happened to include a dead hawk instead of cheese and crackers. The process of mummifying animals varied depending on the species and the budget. High-status animals were embalmed with the same care as humans. Organs removed, natron applied, linen wrapped with amulets inserted. Some bulls were buried in sarcophagi the size of small boats. Others were encased in massive granite coffins weighing over 60 tons. The Serapeum of Saqqara, a burial site for the Apis bulls, is a labyrinth of stone corridors lined with these colossal tombs, each one a monument to a sacred cow that spent its life being worshipped, pampered, and probably fed better than the farmers who raised it. Cheaper mummifications were less elegant. Mass-produced offerings meant shortcuts. Some animals were not embalmed at all, just dried and wrapped. Others were incomplete. Archaeologists have found mummified packages with no bones, just feathers or fur. In some cases, the packages were entirely empty, a decoy, sold to worshippers who could not afford the full animal but still wanted the divine points. These fake mummies were a booming business, spiritually efficient, economically opportunistic. And then there were the truly elaborate animal tombs. The crocodile god Sobek had his own mummified crocodile cemeteries, where reptiles were laid out in rows, mouths sealed with resin, sometimes decorated with gold leaf or stone inlays. One particularly famous crocodile, over 15 feet long, was discovered buried with dozens of mummified baby crocodiles inside its belly. Whether this was symbolic, maternal, or just exceptionally strange, no one is entirely sure. But it does suggest that in the ancient Egyptian spiritual economy, there was no such thing as too many reptiles. The presence of these animals changed the entire afterlife landscape. Your tomb might have shared a wall with a cat crypt. Your offering table might have been next to a hawk chamber. Priests performed daily rituals for sacred animals, offering food, incense, and chants. They cleaned their enclosures, brushed their fur, and recited prayers over their remains. Some temples employed entire staffs just to care for animal cults. You, a fully mummified human, may have spent your afterlife being outprayed and outpolished by a goose. Yet for all the reverence, there was also profit. Temples sold animal mummies to visitors and pilgrims. Vendors specialized in spiritual matchmaking, offering guidance on which animal would best suit your particular prayer. Need help with fertility? Offer a mummified frog. Trouble with communication? Try an ibis. Hoping for military success? Consider a falcon. Want to ward off bad dreams? Category: always cat. This industry created an enormous demand. Animal breeders flourished. Embalmers diversified. Traders moved linen, natron and resin in bulk. The sacred and the commercial walked hand in paw. It was religion, but also logistics. And you, resting in your carefully prepared tomb, were now part of a much larger network. A city of souls. A necropolis packed with wings, claws, paws and hooves, all wrapped, all waiting, all slightly better scented than you. It raises an awkward question. If animals could be mummified and honoured, what made you special? Was it your soul? Your prayers? Your willingness to tip the embalmer for extra amulets? Or was it just that your family happened to have more barley stored in jars? In the grand scheme of eternity, the line between divine pet and pious human grew thin. You're still wrapped in your linen, still surrounded by painted spells and modelled furniture. But somewhere nearby, a mummified baboon with sacred eyeliner and his own burial mask is lying smugly in a chamber with better ventilation. You are a mummy, but so is he. And in the afterlife, status may come down to who had the nicer feathers and a priest who remembered your birthday. But just when you think eternity has finally settled into a quiet routine of spiritual drifting and faint incense, the stone shifts, light pierces the tomb, and suddenly you are discovered. Not by gods or priests or anyone who knows how to pronounce your name correctly, but by strangers in wool hats carrying shovels, notebooks, and a suspicious amount of excitement. Congratulations, you are now an archaeological find. At first, the experience is disorienting. Your body is exhumed, your sarcophagus pried open, dust rises, flashlights flicker, someone makes a joke, someone else takes notes. You're poked, brushed, labelled, and then loaded onto a cart like an awkward sofa that no one wants to be responsible for scratching. You spent thousands of years in divine silence, only to be carried out by a man who once tried to climb into a tomb barefoot because he thought it would be more authentic. This moment, strangely enough, has happened to thousands of mummies. Your unearthing might occur during a well-funded excavation or a completely accidental construction project. In the 19th century, European interest in ancient Egypt reached fever pitch. Archaeologists, adventurers and looters flooded into the Nile Valley. They were armed with pickaxes, dubious permits, and the kind of cultural sensitivity that could be measured in broken pottery shards. Mummies were treated as trophies. They were shipped to Europe in crates marked as antiquities, curiosities, or, in some cases, fertilizer. Yes, fertilizer. During the Victorian period, so many mummies were ground into dust that a trade developed around using them to enrich soil. It was said that Egyptian bone meal made roses bloom brighter. You, a once proud occupant of the duat, were now part of someone's gardening strategy. Even more bewildering was the practice of mummy unwrapping parties. These were exactly what they sound like. A social event where guests gathered to watch the unravelling of an ancient corpse. In candlelit salons across Europe, men in waistcoats and women in lace gloves sipped wine while an Egyptologist or ambitious amateur carefully peeled away layers of ancient linen. It was part science, part spectacle, and entirely horrifying. Every new layer brought gasps, speculation, and the occasional relic pulled from your wrappings like a prize in a grotesque piñata. Sometimes these unwrappings were performed in museums, other times in private homes. People clapped, they made notes, they posed for portraits with your skull. Bits of linen were sometimes handed out as souvenirs. You had crossed from sacred artifact to conversation piece. It was the afterlife as imagined by people who thought phrenology was a real science, and that mummies probably enjoyed being the centre of attention. In some cases, your body was dissected. Scientists studied your bones, they took samples, they removed your wrappings and analysed your teeth. They debated your age, gender, cause of death, and social status. Many conclusions were wrong. If your body was poorly preserved or damaged, they might have mistaken you for someone else entirely. You could be catalogued as male when you were female, royal when you were not, a priest when you were a farmer. Your name, carefully written in spells and carvings, was often ignored in favour of guesswork made by men with moustaches and magnifying glasses. And then there was mummy medicine. For centuries in Europe, powdered mummy was sold as a cure for everything from epilepsy to bruises. Known as mumia, this dark powder was scraped from embalmed flesh, mixed with honey or wine, and sold in apothecaries. It was believed to have mystical properties. No one asked how it was harvested. Few questioned its source. The idea that consuming bits of ancient Egyptian bodies might be spiritually beneficial was surprisingly popular. You, once wrapped in sacred resin and prayers, were now part of someone's lunchtime tonic. Not all mummies were consumed or unwrapped. Some were put on display. You might have found yourself in a glass case, surrounded by museum signage and bored school children. People pressed their noses against the glass. They whispered, they pointed. Some made jokes, others took photos. You became part of an exhibit titled something like Treasures of the Nile or Secrets of the Pharaohs. You were neither a treasure nor a secret. You were a deeply dehydrated corpse hoping for a little dignity and maybe some climate control. Museums struggled with how to display you. Some wrapped you in new linen, others left you fully exposed. In recent years, curators have debated whether mummies should even be displayed at all. Questions of ethics, consent, and cultural ownership have grown louder. Some mummies have been repatriated to Egypt, others remain in storage, catalogued and sealed in dark drawers, where the only visitors are researchers and very confused janitors. Technology has changed the game. CT scans, X-rays, and 3D imaging allow scientists to study mummies without unwrapping them. Your bones are mapped, your organs identified, your facial structure reconstructed with digital modelling. These reconstructions are sometimes displayed alongside your coffin, offering a glimpse into what you may have looked like before your skin shriveled like old fruit leather. The results vary. Sometimes they are respectful. Other times they look like someone used an app designed for Renaissance portraits and forgot to include a nose. Despite all of this, your afterlife continues. People write books about you. Documentaries feature dramatic recreations of your embalming. You're voiced by actors with dramatic British accents. Children watch cartoons based loosely on your mythology. Video games turn your existence into puzzles and loot. You're interpreted, imagined, reconstructed, and endlessly repurposed. Through it all, your purpose remains: to preserve, to remind, to survive. Your body was prepared with the hope that it would last forever, that it would serve as a bridge between this world and the next. You were not meant to be consumed, catalogued, or explained at dinner parties. You were meant to be eternal, and somehow, against every odd, you are. Despite centuries of mishandling, you remain, bones intact, wrappings mostly preserved. Your name may have been lost, but your presence endures. You're still here, still wrapped in mystery and resin, still making people wonder, still whispering across the ages with a silence louder than any inscription. And now your audience is much larger than you ever expected. But not everyone in your afterlife audience is equally remembered. Because in the grand spiritual orchestra of mummified eternity, some voices were quieter by design. If you were a woman in ancient Egypt, your death followed a different path. The gods might have promised the same afterlife, but the journey to get there came with additional layers, not metaphorical ones, linen ones, sometimes twice as many. Being female in life came with its own set of expectations: childbirth, household management, spiritual rituals, the production of beer, and an alarming number of fertility figurines. But in death, things became even more delicate. Embalmers approached female corpses differently, not because of biology, because of belief, a very specific belief that women's bodies were dangerous after death. Not dangerous in the sense of curses or ghosts. Dangerous because embalmers worried that women's remains were too tempting. Historical sources suggest that during certain periods, the embalming of women was delayed, not by hours, by days. Some bodies were left to decompose slightly before embalming began. The reason, while never spelled out with complete clarity, appears in writings from Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus. He claimed that bodies of beautiful women were allowed to rot before embalmers touched them, to prevent inappropriate behaviour. In other words, ancient mortuary policies were written by people with serious trust issues and a fundamental misunderstanding of professionalism. There is no direct evidence of these incidents. No embalming manual says, "Wait 3 days for ethics." But the practice was plausible enough to be recorded by multiple observers. The very fact that ancient texts mention it at all suggests concern. Female bodies were seen not just as sacred, but as vulnerable. Their preservation required an additional layer of social caution. But despite these complications, Egyptian women were mummified with great care. Wealthy women, in particular, received full embalming procedures, internal organs removed, cavities cleansed and packed, linen applied in hundreds of layers, oils and perfumes used in abundance. The presence of certain resins, particularly cinnamon and frankincense, was often higher in female mummies, either as a ritual distinction or a symbolic gesture tied to fragrance and femininity. Your eternal smell mattered. The wrappings of female mummies were sometimes more elaborate, intricate patterns, decorative knots, small amulets placed in specific regions for protection, fertility, and rebirth. Some coffins included painted breasts, elaborate wigs, and makeup rendered in precise brushstrokes. This was not vanity. It was theological continuity. The soul needed to recognize the body. The gods needed to recognize the soul. And in the afterlife, identity was a requirement, not a preference. Certain goddesses were invoked during female mummification: Isis, Hathor, Nephthys. These divine figures symbolized rebirth, protection, and maternal power. Priests often recited hymns to female deities while preparing a woman's body. In some cases, special spells from the coffin texts or Book of the Dead were chosen for women, emphasizing care, beauty, and divine alignment. The afterlife for women was not just survival, it was restoration, a return to youth, vitality, and sacred grace. The social status of women influenced every stage of this process. Royal women were embalmed and buried with astonishing opulence. Queens and princesses often had tombs adjacent to kings, filled with goods, statues, and in some cases full libraries of spells. Their coffins were gilded, their portraits idealized, their jewelry preserved in small caches designed to impress gods and confuse archaeologists for centuries. High priestesses received similarly ornate treatment. Their roles in temple life translated into afterlife privileges. Some were buried with ritual instruments, others with texts documenting their spiritual duties. A few left behind inscriptions that described their divine relationships with specific gods. These were not modest declarations, they were celestial resumes. Eternity, like any bureaucracy, appreciated documentation. Middle-class women had varied experiences. Some could afford full embalming, others were wrapped quickly, buried with a few amulets, and placed in communal tombs. One study of mummified women from the New Kingdom period revealed a wide range of practices, from carefully preserved remains with intact hearts and resin-coated wrappings, to skeletal bundles wrapped in reused linen and stuffed with reeds. The variation was economic, not religious. The gods were egalitarian, the embalmers were not. And then there were the myths, the false stories that clung to female mummies long after their tombs were breached. European fascination with Egyptian women led to wild speculation. Tales of cursed queens, deadly seductresses, mummies who whispered through time and caused madness. Entire novels were written about mysterious female mummies who returned from the grave to haunt, punish, or romance the living. The Victorians were especially fond of this genre. They imagined every female sarcophagus contained a high priestess, a sorceress, or a long-lost love wrapped in gauze and longing. These fantasies were rooted in colonial attitudes and Gothic excess. They ignored the real women inside: mothers, daughters, scribes, artisans, women who brewed beer, ran households, managed estates, and sang hymns to Isis while grinding flour. Their lives were full, their deaths were prepared. Their mummification was not a curse, it was a plan. Modern science has begun to restore their identities. CT scans of female mummies have revealed complex hairstyles, preserved tattoos, and surgical repairs to the spine and teeth. One woman was found to have a bronze dental implant. Another had a carefully repaired pelvis, suggesting that embalmers went to great lengths to maintain bodily integrity. These were not anonymous relics. They were individuals with histories, ailments, preferences, and loved ones who chose every amulet with care. Yet despite all the restoration, most female mummies remain nameless in museums. Their names were lost when tombs collapsed, when coffins were sold, or when records were burned. Their stories are told in fragments. A bead here, a scarab there, the angle of a jawline, the placement of a hand. But even in fragments they speak. You might have been wrapped beside one, or buried above one, or placed in a tomb that once echoed with prayers sung by her children. You were mummified according to ritual, so was she. You carried your heart to the scale, so did she. The gods weighed you both, not by gender, by truth. You are a mummy and so is she, and somewhere in the silence of eternity, your linen rustles in agreement, not out of discomfort, out of the sheer weight of all the things buried with you, because your tomb is full, packed, crammed with objects both sacred and suspiciously impractical. The walls are painted with your deeds, your offerings are neatly arranged, and your afterlife luggage is bursting with items that suggest one fundamental truth. You did not trust the afterlife to provide amenities. Ancient Egyptians treated the tomb like a moving van for the soul. Everything you might need in the next world was packed with you in this one. But the definition of need was generous. Yes, you included bread, beer, and amulets. But you also packed combs, board games, spoons, razors, sandals, statues, musical instruments, footstools, and on at least one occasion, a full-length folding bed made of gold and ivory. It was not just a burial, it was a lifestyle transfer. Food was essential. Loaves of bread were baked specifically for burial. Fruits were dried. Meat was salted. Beer was brewed. Jars were sealed. Entire meals were laid out on low tables inside tombs, often with carefully written labels describing what each dish was supposed to be. Not because the gods needed clarification, because spiritual delivery services require good documentation. Without a label, your soul might receive goat instead of duck, and no one wants to be eternally disappointed by misidentified stew. Utensils came next. You could not rely on the afterlife to stock proper dining equipment, so you packed wooden bowls, ceramic plates, bronze knives, and in wealthier cases silver goblets. Some tombs included complete dining sets, with multiple courses represented in miniature. These were not merely decorative. According to belief, the symbolic items would become real in the afterlife. A wooden duck would become a roast duck. A clay loaf would become a warm loaf. A painted beer jar would pour endlessly if you got your spells right. But not everything was practical. Some tombs included makeup kits, complete with palettes, brushes, kohl eyeliner, and jars of scented oil. Beauty mattered in the next world. Gods responded to presentation. Your spiritual face was expected to be radiant, symmetrical, and very well moisturized. Mirrors were common burial items, usually polished bronze, not just for vanity, for reflection. The act of seeing yourself in the afterlife was tied to your soul's identity. If you could not see your reflection, you might forget who you were, and once forgotten, you risked fading altogether. To prevent this, names were written on everything: coffins, statues, amulets, even sandals. One pair of ancient shoes had the owner's name carved into the soles. You could be barefoot in the afterlife, but you would not be anonymous. Some sandals were even made of papyrus or palm fibre, suggesting that spiritual footwear came in seasonal options. Entertainment was also a consideration. The afterlife was eternal. You needed hobbies. Board games like Senet were common finds in tombs. Senet was a game of movement and strategy, believed to reflect the journey of the soul through the underworld. It came with a decorated board, carved pieces, and sometimes poetic instructions. If you died without knowing how to play, you might have had to fake it in front of the gods. No one wanted to be judged by Osiris while misplacing a game piece. Instruments were also packed. Harps, flutes, sistrums, and tambourines were found in tombs, especially those of musicians or priestesses. Music was sacred. It was used in rituals, celebrations, and funerary rites. In the afterlife, it provided joy and harmony. Some instruments were buried with inscriptions asking the gods to keep them in tune. Others included instructions for use, as if your soul might forget how to operate a drum after 40 days in Natron. But the most fascinating items were personal: letters, love poems, family figurines, a child's lock of hair. Some tombs included dolls or toys, not for use, but for memory, to remind your soul of what mattered in life, to create continuity between the worlds. These objects were fragile, sentimental, and deeply human, and they sat beside jars of embalming resin and bundles of dried onions like nothing was unusual. Then came the strange. One tomb contained a mummified goose with gold foil wrapped around its beak. Another had a set of model fishing nets and carved wooden fish, painted so realistically they appeared to swim through eternity. Some tombs included pet monkeys, buried in their own miniature coffins, wearing jewellery. A few mummies were found with walking sticks, presumably in case their resurrected limbs were stiff from all that sacred preservation. One wealthy woman was buried with 40 hair extensions. Another had a full collection of bronze tweezers and cosmetic tools. A nobleman was interred with 2 folding stools, a hand mirror, and a board game set carved from ivory. One tomb even contained an ancient Egyptian boomerang, a curved throwing stick likely intended for sport or hunting in the spiritual fields of paradise. Eternity, it seemed, was going to be lively. The inclusion of Shabti figures added another layer. These small figurines, often made of faience or wood, were buried in groups. Some tombs had hundreds, each one inscribed with a spell commanding it to do work in the afterlife on your behalf. These were your eternal workforce, spiritually unionized, labor-ready, equipped with tiny farming tools. The gods would call you to plough fields, dig canals, or harvest crops. Your Shakti would answer instead, politely declining on your behalf while hoeing sacred barley. Architectural models were also popular. Miniature houses, granaries, breweries, entire scenes of daily life carved and painted in exquisite detail. These were not toys, they were spiritual real estate previews. If you buried a model bakery, the gods would grant you eternal bread. A model stable meant horses, a model slaughterhouse meant meat. Some tombs included both upscale and practical models, ensuring that your soul had a complete lifestyle package. Even furniture had symbolic power. Beds were common, often carved and gilded. They represented rest and rebirth. Chairs symbolized authority. Headrests, shaped like little wooden half-moons, were placed under the head during burial and expected to support your skull in the next world. The assumption was that your spirit would sit up eventually. It would need somewhere comfortable to put its neck. But perhaps the most personal items were the ones that defied explanation. Amulets shaped like hearts, eyes, beetles, or ears. The ear amulets were especially curious. They were thought to help the gods hear your prayers. Some mummies were buried with multiple ears, just in case one spiritual channel got clogged. It was divine customer service with better listening skills. All of this clutter was intentional. The tomb was not a place to forget. It was a place to remember everything, to preserve not just your body, but your choices, your habits, your comforts, and your beliefs. The gods were not going to provide towels. You brought your own. The underworld did not stock silverware. You carved it in advance. Paradise was not a buffet. It was a potluck, and you were expected to bring your own dishes. You're still here. Your body lies in resin and linen, your tomb packed to the edges with symbolism and the occasional questionably preserved duck. Some items have crumbled, others remain intact, and each one whispers a detail of who you were, a story the embalmer never told, a preference the gods may still notice. Who would have thought your afterlife would come fully furnished? But a throne of gold and a pantry of symbolic goose stew mean nothing if no one remembers your name. Not just your nickname or your title, your actual name. Written, spoken, carved into stone and painted onto wood. Because in ancient Egypt your name was not just how people referred to you, it was your soul's anchor. Without it, you were spiritually unrecognizable. You could be fully embalmed, lavishly buried, amulet stuffed and resin drenched, but if your name disappeared, you did too. This was not a metaphor, it was literal. The ancient Egyptians believed that a person's name, or ren, was one of the essential components of the soul. It existed alongside your ka and ba and ak, forming the complete metaphysical package of your being. Your name was your access code to eternity. It told the gods who you were, where you belonged, and why you deserved entry into paradise. Without it, you were a spiritual orphan. No memory, no destination, no customer service hotline to recover your account. That is why your name was written on everything. Tomb walls, coffin lids, linen wrappings, canopic jars. In some cases, it was even tattooed or branded into objects you never touched. It had to be visible, repeated, preserved, carved so deep into stone that even erosion would need 1,000 years and a strong breeze to wipe it out. Your descendants were expected to say your name aloud during rituals. Priests were paid to read it during offerings, because every time your name was spoken, it extended your existence. It reactivated your soul like a spell typed into the cosmic keyboard of divine remembrance. If your name was erased, it was considered one of the worst fates imaginable. The Egyptians even had a term for it: damnatio memoriae, to be forgotten, to be wiped out of the record. You would wander the afterlife as a blank ghost, disoriented, unfed, unrecognized by the gods. Without a name, the heart on the scale meant nothing. The prayers became static, the spells misfired. You were a glitch in the system, a spirit without a resume. This fear shaped every part of your burial. Your name was painted in multiple places in case one surface failed. Backup inscriptions were added. Secret carvings were hidden in niches or under layers of decoration. Even the opening of the mouth ritual, performed to reawaken your senses in the afterlife, was sometimes recited with your name at every stage. Touch the eyes, speak the name, touch the mouth, speak the name again. Divine reactivation through repetition. Portraits were another layer of identity protection, especially during the Greco-Roman period, when mummification styles evolved to include lifelike paintings placed over the face. These Fayum portraits were not symbolic renderings. They were individualized. Painted in encaustic wax on wood, they captured age, clothing, jewelry, and sometimes emotion. They were not meant for the living. They were meant for the gods, a visual reminder. This is who I am. This is who you are judging. Please do not mix me up with the guy in the next tomb who got embalmed sideways. But even before that period, coffins included stylized faces, carved or painted, calm, serene, ideally symmetrical. The idea was not to preserve beauty, it was to preserve identity. The soul was expected to recognize its container. If you woke up after death and your coffin had the wrong face, you might walk past it entirely, which could lead to embarrassing afterlife delays. Nobody wants to miss their own resurrection window because someone carved the wrong nose. This obsession with facial recognition extended to statues. Tombs often included K statues. These were sculpted likenesses placed in niches to serve as backups. If your body decomposed, or if tomb robbers smashed your face out of spite, the statue would serve as a new resting place for your car. They were carved with uncanny detail. Even the folds of the ears were sometimes exaggerated to enhance recognition. In the afterlife, the gods did not want to guess. They wanted confirmation. There were also spells specifically designed to defend your name, some from the pyramid texts, others from the coffin texts or Book of the Dead. These spells invoke divine protection against name erasure. One popular version instructed the gods to strike down anyone who tried to damage your inscription. Another warned that your name was guarded by a fire-breathing cobra with an exceptionally unforgiving attitude. Some texts suggested that if your name was lost, you could regenerate it by appealing directly to Thoth, the god of writing, assuming you could still speak and had not been eaten by Amit out of administrative confusion. And yet, despite all this careful planning, names were often lost. Tombs were looted, walls eroded, Priests stopped performing the rituals. Political enemies defaced monuments. Even pharaohs were not safe. Akhenaten, the heretic king who promoted monotheism and moved the capital, had his name systematically chiseled out after his death. Statues were smashed, cartouches erased. It was not just political revenge, it was metaphysical assassination. The logic was simple: remove the name, remove the power, erase the cartouche, and the person could not be summoned, honoured, or remembered. The gods might still know who you were, but without the written evidence, your afterlife became compromised. You could linger, but not live. Exist, but not participate. Your eternal narrative was interrupted. You became spiritually incomplete, and there was no reset button. This made record-keeping a sacred act. Scribes were not just bureaucrats, they were defenders of souls. Every name they wrote was a spiritual preservation. Every misstroke could alter destiny. Some scribes went blind from decades of ink and papyrus. Others developed arthritis from carving hieroglyphs into stone, but they continued, because the cost of forgetting was too high. You, of course, had your name written everywhere, inside your coffin, on your shroud, on your canopic jars, on the offering stela, on a small scarab sewn into the folds of your chest linen. Some inscriptions even included a contingency spell, requesting that if the reader forgets your name, they speak a prayer for the unnamed one instead, just in case. Still, you wonder, what happens if one person remembers you incorrectly? What if they pronounce your name with the wrong inflection? What if the archaeologist who finds your tomb guesses your gender and renames you entirely in a museum catalogue? What if the museum uses a display card that says unknown male, circa 1300 BCE, even though you were a woman, a priestess, a mother and a scribe? You remain silent because you have no choice. You are sealed, wrapped, your identity carved in limestone, your face painted on wood, your name whispered once a millennium by a curious student reading aloud in a dusty exhibit. People still manage to whisper your name, but long before your name was whispered over a glass display or misread in a museum brochure, it passed through the nose and possibly over the breakfast table of a man with a bronze hook, calloused fingers, and a job description that included the phrase organ removal. You didn't mummify yourself. You had help. Skilled, methodical, underpaid help. The ancient Egyptian embalmer was equal parts surgeon, priest, artist, janitor, chemist, and part-time therapist for grieving relatives who wanted you preserved without any visible flaws, which was difficult considering you had recently stopped breathing and started leaking. These men worked in spaces known as the Ibu, or purification tent. That term may conjure the image of a serene, incense-scented pavilion. In practice, it was often a temporary structure near the edge of town, close to the river but downwind from everything else, for reasons that become very obvious by the second day of decomposition. The Ibu was not a glamorous place. It was functional, shaded but open, full of water basins, natron crates, sharp tools, linen strips, clay jars, and the omnipresent scent of hot resin and bodily ambiguity. The head embalmer held the title of Hiri Seshta, or He Who Is Over the Secrets. That was not metaphorical. He literally held your secrets, your body, your inner workings, your soul's physical container. He was trained not only in anatomy but in ritual. He knew the spells, he knew the oils, he knew exactly where to place an amulet so your spleen did not offend a god. His knowledge was sacred and dangerous. Embalmers walked a thin line between priesthood and pollution. They were revered and avoided, respected and whispered about. Because touching the dead, even with divine intent, came with spiritual side effects. There was an entire crew involved in the process. Assistants prepared the tools, apprentices handled the linen, resin boys stirred the boiling mixtures that would soon harden into glossy funerary lacquer. Someone had to grind the natron. someone had to fetch the sacred oils, and someone had to stand quietly and pretend the smell was not ruining their will to live. These were specialized workers, trained in specific tasks, all coordinated under the leadership of the hairy Seshta, who likely had strong opinions about the proper angle for organ removal and an extremely high tolerance for heat and humidity. The first act was the purification. Your body was washed with water from the Nile. This was not symbolic, it was strategic. The Nile was sacred. Its water connected life to the gods. Washing the body removed both dirt and spiritual impurity. It also, ideally, delayed the worst aspects of decay. From there, the procedure became a choreographed performance of slicing, draining, scooping, drying, and stuffing. The bronze hook used to extract the brain was not used casually. It required technique. One wrong move and you ended up with a collapsed face and a lawsuit from the gods of symmetry. Once your brain was liquefied and drained through the nostrils, the abdominal incision followed. This was made carefully on the left side, the traditional cut zone. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were removed and placed in natron before being sealed into canopic jars. The heart, ideally, was left in the body or stored with special care. Sometimes it was removed by accident and replaced with a wax version, in the hope that no one noticed. Embalmers were good at their job. They were not miracle workers. After the organs were out, the body was packed inside and out with natron. This step took time. 40 days was standard. You became a human sponge drying on a sacred rack. Embalmers rotated you occasionally, checked for leaks, adjusted wrappings, added herbs to control the smell. Then, once sufficiently desiccated, they began the reconstruction. Gaps were filled with linen, sawdust, and resin-soaked pads. Eyes were replaced with carved stones or onions. Cheeks were plumped. Limbs were repositioned. You were sculpted like a sacred mannequin, except the goal was to look serene and not entirely human. The wrapping process was even more complicated. Embalmers used dozens of layers, each applied with ritual. Prayers were recited, amulets were inserted between folds, certain body parts were wrapped separately. Each finger, each toe, the head, the torso, the limbs. Resin was brushed over layers to harden them. Sometimes the final result looked elegant. Other times you resembled a cocoon that had been through a rough thunderstorm. The quality varied depending on budget, training, and whether the embalmers had slept recently. They were under pressure. Families expected results. The tomb was already being prepared. The priests were rehearsing the incantations. The weepers were standing by. And here the embalmers were, trying to align your jawbone and secure your nostrils while a group of relatives stood outside complaining about the smell of burning frankincense. These men worked long hours, in hot conditions, surrounded by the dead. They were professionals. They also occasionally took shortcuts. Some embalmers reused linen, some diluted resins, some replaced missing organs with rags and hoped the gods were in a forgiving mood. Yet they believed in what they were doing. They wore masks of Anubis during rituals. They recited the proper hymns. They honoured the sacred order of operations. Embalming was not just a technical skill, it was a spiritual duty. Each action mirrored the myth of Osiris, his dismemberment, his restoration, his resurrection. The embalmer played the role of divine healer, restoring order to the body, preparing it for judgment, ensuring the soul could speak its name, stand before the scales, and not immediately fall apart under divine scrutiny. Socially, embalmers occupied a strange position. They were needed but not always liked. Handling the dead was considered spiritually risky. Embalmers were thought to be ritually impure and often had to undergo purification rites themselves. Some lived in isolated communities. Others worked in temple precincts. Their hands were sacred tools. Their homes were sometimes avoided. It was said that marrying into an embalmer's family could affect your spiritual cleanliness. Yet when death came, everyone sought them out. They developed their own traditions, passed down recipes for embalming oils, shared secret techniques, argued about linen folding methods. Some wrote their names inside coffins they prepared, a quiet claim to their work. You might be lying on the handiwork of a craftsman whose lineage stretched back generations. Men who learned the art from fathers and uncles, who measured their success not in wealth, but in the preservation of the people they prepared. And here you lie, still wrapped, still intact, because someone long ago stood beside your body in the heat and humidity and did the work, removed the decay, spoke the prayers, sealed the resin, aligned your limbs, whispered your name as they tied the final knot. They are long gone, their names erased, but their work survives, and you are someone's masterpiece. But even the most perfectly embalmed body is not safe if your soul fails to reach its destination. That is the part the living often forget. Dying was only the beginning. Mummification prepared the body, but what followed was a spiritual adventure that made very little architectural sense. The Egyptian afterlife was not a serene cloud-based lounge. It was an elaborate, shape-shifting landscape filled with rivers of fire, gates guarded by knife-wielding monsters, upside-down lakes, self-operating decapitators, and mysterious doors that would only open if you remembered the correct name of the doorknob. The ancient Egyptians called this place the Duat, part underworld, part spirit realm, part divine interrogation complex designed by a team of gods who clearly loved riddles. It was described in texts like the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates. These were not just poetic metaphors, they were detailed maps. Each chamber was illustrated, each hazard explained. Some texts even included diagrams showing where to turn left at a fire pit, or how to avoid the serpent that breathed poison from both ends. You are not expected to wander the Duat blindly. That would be dangerous and deeply embarrassing. Instead, you carried spells, or rather, your tomb carried them, written on walls, coffins, scrolls, and amulets. These were instructions, passwords, travel guides. The Book of the Dead was essentially a spiritual survival manual, like a celestial travel app, but with more instructions about shouting magical phrases at crocodile-headed gatekeepers and less advice about restaurant reviews. The Duat was divided into sections, sometimes 12, sometimes 21. It depended on the text and the dynasty. Each section contained different features: underground rivers, fields of reeds, mountains of iron, lakes of fire. Some areas were peaceful, others were hostile. There were corridors where you had to walk backwards, roads made of knives, bridges made of light, and occasionally enormous snakes who existed solely to determine whether your soul was paying attention during embalming class. One such serpent was Apophis, a colossal snake of darkness and chaos. His job was to try and devour the sun god Ra as he journeyed through the underworld each night. Apophis did not take breaks. He attacked every evening. Ra had to fight him off with spears, spells, and sometimes backup from gods like Set, who despite being generally problematic was very effective at snake stabbing. This cosmic battle took place near you. Not metaphorically, literally. Your tomb was a gateway. The sun passed through it. You were a bystander to daily divine combat, hoping that Ra succeeded, because if he did not, there would be no sunrise and your afterlife would be permanently paused. Other creatures you might encounter included baboons with knives, crocodile lions that judged your organs, and large beetles who spoke in riddles and expected emotional honesty. Many of these were guardians of gates. To pass through a gate, you had to speak the correct spell. Sometimes it was a full incantation. Other times it was the name of the door itself. Yes, the door had a name. So did the lock. So did the hinges. If you forgot any of them, the door would not open, and the gods would quietly pretend they did not know you. There were also lakes of flame. These were not punishment zones. They were purification baths. You were expected to walk through them to cleanse your spiritual body. If you were properly prepared, you passed through unharmed. If not, you were flamed into oblivion by fire-headed beings who didn't appreciate stalling. One section of the duat was filled with knives that floated in the air. Another was a hallway of decapitating doors that opened and slammed shut in rhythm. If you timed your spell wrong, your head joined the collection of spiritual cautionary tales. Not all of the duat was terrifying. Some parts were gentle, lush fields, flowing rivers, fruit trees, cool breezes. These were previews of the Field of Reeds, the Egyptian paradise. You could see it in the distance, glimpses of eternity just past the horizon. But to get there, you had to pass through all the tests, answer all the riddles, recite all the spells, and keep your limbs intact. Your soul was not alone. Your Ba and Kay travelled too. They occasionally separated, flapped around, then rejoined you at checkpoints like a poorly organised spiritual airport. You were often depicted as being guided by Anubis or Thoth. Anubis, with his jackal head and calm demeanour, ensured your physical remains stayed protected. Thoth, with his ibis head and writing tools, recorded everything. He wrote down your answers, your mistakes, your hesitations. He probably also judged your grammar. If you passed, you reached the Hall of Two Truths. There, your heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. We have been over this part. The feather was truth. The heart was your soul's moral weight. If you passed, you entered paradise. If you failed, you were eaten by Amit, who had not had a satisfying meal since the last time someone lied about stealing temple bread. The geography of the duat was meant to be overwhelming, not as punishment, as process. The journey purified you, proved you, burned away confusion, strengthened memory, rewarded preparation. This was a land where knowing the name of a crocodile was as important as living a virtuous life, where forgetfulness was fatal, where spiritual geography was shaped by your ability to speak magic at exactly the right time with exactly the right intonation. And that is why your tomb was so packed with texts, spells on the walls, spells on the floor, spells wrapped into your bandages. Your coffin was less a box and more a textbook. You studied in death. You revised in linen. You whispered memorized lines while stepping over rivers that ran uphill. The afterlife was a performance. You had rehearsed. You're still here, still wrapped, but your soul is travelling through darkness and light, through corridors of symbols, past guardians with names like He Who Eats Shadows and She Who Measures Ankles. You remember the words, you speak them calmly, the gates open. You keep walking because eternity is a test you are passing. You survived embalming, avoided flaming lakes, passed the judgment scales, and were spiritually escorted into the Field of Reeds by a jackal-headed god with impeccable posture. But somewhere, far above your tomb, centuries later, a man trips over a rock, blames the wind, then mutters something about the curse of the mummy. This is how it begins, not with sacred wrath, not with magical vengeance, but with clumsiness, newspapers, and the human need to blame something that cannot talk back. The idea of a mummy's curse is one of the most persistent myths in modern history, popularized by explorers, authors, journalists, and filmmakers. It paints you not as a preserved soul hoping for peace, but as a vengeful relic waiting to exact revenge on anyone foolish enough to open your sarcophagus. The truth is that ancient Egyptians did not believe in curses as they are imagined today. There were protective spells, there were warnings, but most inscriptions did not say beware or die. They said, remember, speak my name, leave my tomb alone unless you come with offerings and a basic understanding of ritual etiquette. There were exceptions. A few tombs did include ominous inscriptions, one famously translated to something like, "I will seize the neck of he who enters this tomb." But that line loses some of its menace when you realise it was carved next to an offering list that included duck, beer and bread with honey. The tomb's occupant was not conjuring vengeance. They were just very particular about their guest list. Ancient Egyptians believed in spiritual consequences. Disturbing a tomb could disrupt the soul's journey. But the punishment was metaphysical. It affected the perpetrator's afterlife, not their plumbing. You would not wake up to find scorpions in your bed or sand pouring from your eyes. You might be cursed in the sense that your name would be forgotten, or your soul would wander the duat confused and nameless, which admittedly is less cinematic but far more terrifying to someone who took the Book of the Dead seriously. The modern obsession with curses did not come from the tomb walls. It came from the people who dug through them. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 lit a match under the collective imagination of the Western world. When Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of the expedition, died a few months later from a mosquito bite gone septic, newspapers pounced. Headlines screamed about mummies' curses. Lights flickered in Cairo. A dog howled. Somewhere, a journalist high on poetic timing declared that ancient forces had been awakened. They had not. What had been awakened was the press's love for drama and the public's thirst for mystery. The curse narrative grew. Other members of the excavation team died in the years that followed. Some of old age, some of unrelated accidents. All were blamed on the tomb. Never mind that most of them lived for decades after the discovery. Howard Carter, the man who opened the tomb and poked around its treasures for years, lived to be 64 and died of lymphoma with no sign of supernatural retribution. But by then, the legend was too powerful. The mummy's curse was official. Books were written, films were made. Tourists came in droves to see exhibits, while nervously clutching their museum brochures like magical talismans. Hollywood sealed the deal. Beginning in the 1930s, films about cursed mummies cemented the idea that opening a tomb meant automatic doom. These fictional mummies were reanimated corpses with a talent for slow walking, spooky staring, and just enough magic to turn sand into vengeance. They were always angry, always male, always looking for a lost love or a sacred scroll that someone inevitably read aloud even though they were clearly warned not to. These depictions had little to do with Egyptian belief, and everything to do with the Western imagination. The real mummies were silent, still, sacred. They were not crawling out of tombs to strangle people. They were lying quietly, hoping their name had not been misfiled by a curator with poor handwriting. The fear was external, projected, a mix of colonial guilt, archaeological anxiety, and the deeply human fear of being haunted by something older and wiser than yourself. That said, there were practical risks to entering a sealed tomb. Ancient air trapped for millennia could contain bacteria, mold, or toxic gases. Some scientists speculated that spores in tombs might cause respiratory issues. A few archaeologists developed unexplained illnesses, but so did thousands of workers in dusty environments across the globe. Blaming a curse was easier than admitting you should have worn a mask or checked the air quality before crawling into a crypt built before iron tools existed. Artifacts also played a role in the legend. Tales of cursed statues, haunted jewellery, or cursed papyrus abounded. Some of these stories involved items looted from tombs and sold on the black market. When bad luck followed, the owners returned the items to museums, often with notes begging curators to please take it back before my cat gets sick again. Museums, unsurprisingly, welcomed the returns but rarely reported any actual supernatural activity. The worst thing that usually happened was mislabeling or a faulty climate control system. And then there were the performers, spiritualists, mediums, occultists who claimed to channel the spirits of ancient Egyptians. Some held seances in candlelit rooms with mummified hands on the table. Others warned of tomb openings scheduled for specific dates, urging people to prepare for cosmic backlash. None of them spoke Middle Egyptian. None of them could explain why the wrath of the gods waited for a Tuesday. But their performances sold tickets, and for many that was enough. Meanwhile, you remained in your tomb or your display case. You didn't blink, you did not curse, you didn't reach out with linen-wrapped hands and rearrange furniture. You simply lay there, preserved, silent, watching as the living projected their fears onto your silence and called it justice. You were not a warning, you were a prayer, a promise. A body transformed into memory by people who believed eternity could be sculpted into bone and resin. Who would have thought that you never needed a curse? You had patience. And you needed it. Because ancient Egyptian time was not a straight line. It was not a countdown. It was not a race to the top, the bottom, or the next quarter's divine prophets. Time, to the ancient Egyptian, was a cycle, a pattern, a rhythm that repeated itself forever, endlessly predictable and yet impossibly profound. Your afterlife was not a reward in the sense of a finish line. It was a continuation, a return to harmony, a rotation in the great cosmic calendar where death was just a highly elaborate intermission. The Egyptian word for this cyclical order was ma'at. It meant truth, balance, cosmic correctness. It was what kept the Nile flooding on schedule, what made the stars return each season, and what allowed the sun to rise again after Ra's nightly fight with a serpent the size of a freight train. Living in accordance with Ma'at meant you respected the rhythm. You played your part in the pattern. You honoured the past, contributed to the present, and planned for a future that was not your own. This mindset shaped everything. Temples were aligned with solstices. Tombs were built with astronomical precision. Festivals were timed to celestial events. Even your coffin was painted with stars across the lid, because you were meant to lie beneath them and eventually become one. Eternity was not metaphorical. It was spatial, architectural. You did not just go to the afterlife. You entered a room built for it. A room you started designing before your third child had finished teething. The calendar itself was brilliant in its simplicity and its absurdity. The Egyptians divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each. That gave them 360 days. Then they added 5 extra days called the epigomenal days, which were considered both sacred and slightly hazardous, as if the year had decided to go off script for a week, and everyone agreed not to ask too many questions. These days were filled with mythological chaos, the birthdays of the gods, the days when time leaked and the usual rules looked the other way. But even the calendar was a tool, not a destination. What mattered more was the idea that time was recursive. The Nile would rise, the crops would grow, the ceremonies would be performed, the sun would vanish into the underworld and rise again in the morning, exhausted but triumphant. This cycle was not just comforting, it was structural. It explained life, it explained death. It explained why building a tomb that took 20 years made perfect sense, because what else was time for if not preparing for the part of your existence that lasted the longest? This long-term thinking extended to monuments. Pyramids were built with limestone blocks that weighed several tons each and were carved to within fractions of an inch. Obelisks were quarried, polished, inscribed, and hauled hundreds of miles because the gods were not interested in shortcuts. Temples were designed to last thousands of years, and they have. Their builders are long gone, their names etched into dust, but the buildings remain. Weathered, chipped, misinterpreted and photographed by confused tourists, but still there. And all of this pointed toward the central idea that your name, your image, and your legacy needed to persist. You could not rely on your descendants to remember you out of habit. You had to plan for it. Tomb inscriptions repeated your name dozens of times. Statues were placed where they would be seen by the living and the divine. Some tombs included images of offerings so that even if no one brought actual food, the gods might be tricked into thinking you were still well fed. This was not superstition. It was spiritual architecture. You were building a future you would never see, but that you would somehow inhabit, which is more than most people do with their living rooms. The Egyptians were not just planning for their children, they were planning for their eternity. A society that could invest generations into constructing a single burial complex was not confused about priorities. They had slow confidence, and bricks, a lot of bricks. But this long-term thinking was not passive, it was actively maintained. Rituals were repeated for centuries. Priests memorized entire liturgical calendars that took years to complete. The same festivals happened in the same places with the same offerings, because they were not about novelty. They were about reinforcing cosmic stability. If you skipped the right chant, maybe the sun would hesitate, maybe the Nile would sulk, maybe Ra would lose the fight with the snake and the world would drown in darkness, and everyone would blame the temple baker for forgetting the sacred goose pies. This obsession with continuity extended into language. Hieroglyphs were not just writing, they were magic. The word for writing was also the word for creation. To write something was to give it life. To chisel a name into stone was to give it weight in the afterlife. To erase that name was to erase the person. The Egyptian scribe was not just a bureaucrat. He was a time engineer. He shaped eternity with ink and precision. Your coffin probably includes a calendar of offerings, a schedule of rituals, a timeline of how you should be honoured across generations. You expected people to follow it. You expected your memory to be curated. You were willing to spend a fortune on resin, linen, oils, stone and sacred text because you were investing in your soul's real estate portfolio. Not for 10 years, not for 100, but for eternity. And you defined eternity in architectural terms. You understood that erosion would happen, that floods would come, that dynasties would fall, but you planned anyway, because planning was power. Your legacy was not just a memory, it was a structure, and you built it with an understanding of time that very few civilizations have dared to match. Now you lie still, wrapped, preserved. A bundle of deliberate intention in a world that often forgets what it meant to take time seriously. Your tomb may be broken, your rituals may be paused, but your preparation echoes. Every block, every glyph, every oil-slicked layer of linen is a sentence written in the language of patience, and you are still on schedule. If you've made it this far without accidentally awakening an ancient curse, or knocking over a sacred jar with your clumsy modern imagination, congratulations. You're now officially more spiritually organized than most 18th dynasty pharaohs. If you're still awake, go ahead and hit that like button or subscribe for more sleepy dives into history's weirdest closets. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time you started unraveling tonight. Now rest easy. The jackal's watching over your intestines.